Some people think the worst thing that can happen in public is making a mistake. They're wrong. The worst thing is when someone with power decides to make you feel invisible. The dinner rush at Hawthorne and Glass had settled into its polished rhythm, the soft clink of crystal, the muted hum of expensive conversations, and the warm amber glow from oversized chandeliers reflecting across polished walnut tables. Every server moved with practiced precision, careful not to interrupt the illusion of perfection that wealthy guests expected when a single meal cost more than many families spent on groceries in a week. Naomi Brooks balanced a silver tray against one hand as she crossed the dining room with steady steps, her black apron freshly pressed, her name tag catching the light for only a moment before disappearing beneath the shadow of another passing guest. At 26, she had mastered the art of becoming almost invisible, smiling when spoken to, listening without interrupting, remembering favorite drinks and birthdays, making every customer feel important while asking for nothing in return. Most nights that was enough. Tonight would be different. Near the center of the restaurant sat Ethan Caldwell, the white CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, surrounded by investors, attorneys, and executives whose tailored suits carried the quiet confidence of people accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives before breakfast. Ethan's face had become familiar across television interviews and magazine covers. He often spoke about leadership, innovation, and treating people with dignity. A framed newspaper article celebrating his company's commitment to workplace respect even hung near the restaurant entrance. It was difficult to reconcile that polished public image with the impatient expression now spreading across his face as he glanced at his watch for the third time in less than a minute. Naomi approached carefully, placing a perfectly prepared entree in front of one guest before turning toward Ethan with his order. Just as she lowered the plate, another server hurried behind her carrying a heavy tray. The slightest brush against Naomi's elbow shifted her balance. Only a few drops of rosemary butter slipped onto the white linen beside Ethan's plate, barely larger than a silver dollar. The mistake lasted less than a second. Ethan reacted as though the room had collapsed. His chair scraped sharply across the hardwood floor as he stood, the sudden noise cutting through every conversation. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Glasses remained suspended above tables. Dozens of eyes turned toward the center of the dining room. Ethan looked directly at Naomi, his voice carrying far beyond his own table. Is this really the level of service this place hires now? His words echoed against the high ceilings. Naomi immediately reached for a clean linen cloth, her hands calm despite the heat rising in her cheeks. I'm very sorry, sir. Let me replace everything immediately. Before she could move, Ethan snatched the dinner plate from the table and deliberately tipped it forward. The steak, vegetables, and sauce slid onto the polished floor with a heavy splash that silenced the entire restaurant. Now you have something worth cleaning, he said coldly. The room remained frozen. No one laughed. No one spoke. Several guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared at Naomi, waiting to see whether she would defend herself. She didn't. She simply inhaled once, knelt carefully, and reached for the scattered dishes with quiet dignity, never allowing anger to replace professionalism. At a nearby booth, a 14-year-old girl who had been live-streaming her birthday dinner instinctively turned her phone toward the unexpected confrontation. She never imagined the camera in her trembling hands had just captured the first seconds of a moment that, before another sunrise, millions of Americans would watch with disbelief. For several long seconds, the only sound inside Hawthorne and Glass came from a spoon slowly rolling across polished hardwood before settling beneath an empty chair. Naomi Brooks carefully gathered the broken pieces of porcelain into a small bus tub, her movements steady despite dozens of strangers watching every breath she took. She did not rush. She did not argue. She simply finished the task that had become hers the moment someone else decided her dignity was less valuable than his pride. Her manager, Daniel Foster, hurried across the dining room with an apologetic smile stretched tightly across his face. He quietly offered to finish cleaning, but Naomi answered with a gentle shake of her head. It is all right, she whispered. I have it. Daniel wanted to say something else. Instead, he glanced toward Ethan Caldwell, who had already returned to his seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Around the table, several executives avoided eye contact. A few continued eating in uncomfortable silence. The expensive restaurant slowly returned to its polished rhythm, but the warmth had disappeared. Naomi carried the damaged dishes through the swinging kitchen doors where the bright dining room instantly gave way to the familiar sounds of running water, sizzling grills, and cooks calling out orders. Nobody spoke to her at first. They had all heard what happened. They had all seen enough through the narrow service window. Maria Hernandez, the pastry chef, quietly placed a fresh towel beside the sink without saying a word. Anthony, another server, rested a hand on Naomi's shoulder for only a second before returning to his station. Their silence carried more kindness than any speech could have offered. Naomi rinsed the last plate beneath warm water, watching butter and sauce disappear into the drain. She stared at the flowing water for a moment longer than necessary, then folded the towel with the same care she used to fold every napkin before the evening shift. She had learned years ago that some people looked for any excuse to mistake emotion for weakness. She refused to give them one. Few people inside the restaurant knew what waited beyond the end of her shift. Every night, after closing, Naomi drove nearly 50 miles to a quiet neighborhood outside Baltimore where her mother, Lorraine Brooks, rested in a small brick home surrounded by aging maple trees. Multiple prescription bottles lined the kitchen counter beside handwritten appointment reminders. Medical bills sat neatly organized inside a worn blue folder because Naomi believed problems felt smaller when they were kept in order. Nearly every dollar she earned from long hours on her feet went toward groceries, medication, and keeping the lights on. There were easier paths she could have taken, better-paying jobs she had applied for, interviews that had ended with polite smiles and promises that never became phone calls. Still, she refused to let disappointment harden her heart. Customers remembered her because she asked about their grandchildren, celebrated anniversaries they forgot to mention, and somehow made every table feel less rushed than the rest of the world outside. Back in the dining room, the teenage girl who had been celebrating her birthday lowered her phone and replayed the recording with growing disbelief. She had started streaming only to capture laughter, birthday candles, and dessert. Instead, she found herself staring at several uninterrupted minutes that showed every word, every expression, and every moment Naomi chose grace instead of anger. She quietly saved the video before slipping her phone into her purse, never imagining that before the next dinner service began, people in every corner of the country would be sharing those same images while asking themselves a single question. How could someone remain so composed after being treated that way? By the time the last guest drifted into the cool evening air, Ethan Caldwell had already forgotten the waitress whose quiet apology had briefly interrupted his dinner. His black luxury sedan glided through downtown Baltimore with the effortless confidence that came from tinted windows, private security, and a driver who knew every shortcut between power and privilege. The city lights reflected across the polished glass like scattered stars, but Ethan never looked outside. His attention remained fixed on tomorrow's presentation displayed across the tablet resting on his lap. Every slide reinforced the image he had spent years carefully building. Visionary, philanthropist, champion of modern leadership. Those words followed his name through business magazines, financial news programs, and keynote conferences from New York to San Francisco. Investors admired his discipline. Young entrepreneurs quoted his interviews. Universities invited him to speak about ethical leadership in the workplace. Few people ever questioned the difference between the man who stood beneath bright stage lights and the one who emerged when the cameras disappeared. Early the next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caldwell Dynamics headquarters, illuminating marble floors so spotless they reflected every passing silhouette. Employees arrived carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, greeting one another in practiced professional voices before disappearing into elevators that climbed toward executive offices overlooking the harbor. Mounted across the reception wall hung the company's mission statement in brushed stainless steel letters. People first. Integrity always. Visitors often paused to photograph those words before checking in with security. Ethan appreciated that. Image mattered. Reputation mattered even more. Inside the executive conference room, department heads gathered around a polished walnut table while large digital screens displayed quarterly growth projections. Ethan entered precisely on schedule. Conversations stopped immediately. Chairs shifted, not because anyone had been instructed to stand, but because they had learned long ago that disappointing the chief executive rarely ended well for careers. He greeted no one personally. Instead, he opened the meeting by correcting a minor formatting error on the first presentation slide. The room fell silent. A junior analyst quietly apologized. Ethan simply nodded before moving on, never raising his voice, never needing to. His disappointment alone carried enough weight to make experienced professionals second-guess themselves. During a short break, his communications director, Melissa Grant, reviewed the upcoming media schedule. A television interview about corporate responsibility had been confirmed for Friday morning. A charity gala honoring workplace inclusion would follow that evening. Ethan approved every appearance with calm confidence. Public goodwill had become another business asset, one cultivated as carefully as quarterly profits. Outside the conference room, employees exchanged polite smiles whenever he passed, but conversations rarely continued until he disappeared around another corner. Respect existed. Warmth did not. Back across town, Hawthorne and Glass prepared for another dinner service. Naomi arrived 15 minutes early, just as she always did. She tied her apron, polished silverware until every fork reflected the overhead lights, and quietly greeted each coworker with the same gentle smile she offered every morning regardless of how difficult the previous night had been. Daniel studied her face for a moment before asking if she wanted the evening off. Naomi thanked him but declined. Bills did not pause for painful memories. Neither did responsibility. She picked up her order pad, inhaled slowly, and stepped back onto the dining room floor. At almost the same moment, hundreds of miles away in countless homes, apartments, coffee shops, and college dorm rooms, a short video uploaded by a 14-year-old birthday guest quietly began appearing in recommendation feeds. At first, only a handful of strangers watched. Then they watched again. Then they sent it to someone else. The numbers climbed so gradually that no one inside the restaurant noticed. Not yet. The video continued spreading quietly through the morning, crossing state lines and time zones one share at a time, while life inside Hawthorne and Glass unfolded as if nothing had changed. Naomi Brooks welcomed guests with the same calm smile, refilled coffee cups before anyone had to ask, and remembered that one elderly couple always preferred extra lemon with their iced tea. Her kindness was never loud. It lived in small moments that most people overlooked. Shortly after noon, the front doors opened, and an older gentleman entered alone, dressed in a navy sport coat that looked expensive despite its age. His silver hair was neatly combed, but his breathing seemed slightly heavier than it should have been. Naomi noticed it immediately. Years of caring for her mother had taught her to recognize subtle signs that others often ignored. She guided him to a quiet corner table away from the afternoon crowd and offered him a glass of water before he even requested it. The gentleman smiled gratefully, introducing himself only as Mr. Whitmore. He admitted he had been driving for nearly 4 hours after visiting his younger brother in another state. Naomi suggested he take his time before ordering and quietly asked the kitchen to prepare a simple meal with less sodium after noticing the medical bracelet partially hidden beneath his shirt cuff. None of her co-workers questioned the request. They trusted her instincts. 20 minutes later, as Mr. Whitmore lifted his fork for another bite, Naomi noticed his expression suddenly change. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. One hand reached toward his throat before resting against the edge of the table. Most diners continued eating, unaware that anything was wrong, but Naomi was already moving. She arrived beside him with steady confidence, speaking in a calm voice that never invited panic. "Sir, stay with me. Take slow breaths if you can." Daniel immediately called emergency services while another server cleared space around the table. Naomi encouraged the gentleman to remain seated and monitored his breathing, reassuring him with quiet words until paramedics arrived only minutes later. The lead paramedic later explained that Naomi's quick recognition of the warning signs and her ability to keep the situation calm had likely prevented a far more serious medical emergency. Mr. Whitmore squeezed her hand before being escorted outside, thanking her with eyes that reflected relief more than fear. Several guests applauded softly as the ambulance doors closed. Naomi smiled politely, then returned to collecting empty plates as though helping another human being required no recognition at all. Late that afternoon, while she polished wine glasses near the service station, Daniel walked over carrying his phone. "Naomi," he said gently, "have you looked online today?" She shook her head. Social media rarely found space between double shifts, grocery shopping, doctor appointments, and the long drive to her mother's house. Daniel hesitated before turning the screen toward her. Thousands of comments scrolled beneath a familiar video. The view count had climbed into the hundreds of thousands. New shares appeared almost every second. Strangers from cities she had never visited were discussing the woman who stayed calm after being humiliated in front of an entire restaurant. Some praised her grace. Others questioned the behavior of the businessman. Reporters had already begun contacting the restaurant asking for statements. Naomi looked at the screen for only a moment before quietly handing the phone back. "I just hope everyone remembers to be kind," she said softly. She returned to polishing the final glass, unaware that somewhere inside a downtown office tower, Ethan Caldwell's public relations team had just received their first urgent email with the subject line that no executive ever wanted to read. "We have a reputation crisis developing." Within hours, what had started as a single birthday live stream transformed into something no public relations strategy could contain. The original clip had been reposted thousands of times, but viewers were no longer sharing only the moment of humiliation. Someone had edited together two videos recorded less than 24 hours apart. The first showed Naomi Brooks quietly cleaning food from the restaurant floor after being publicly embarrassed. The second captured her calmly helping an elderly guest whose medical emergency could have turned tragic if she had ignored the warning signs. The contrast spread faster than anyone expected. Television stations replayed both moments side by side. Morning talk shows debated leadership, humility, and the treatment of service workers. Business commentators questioned whether a company's public values meant anything if its leader behaved differently when no cameras were supposed to be watching. At Caldwell Dynamics headquarters, every conference room screen displayed the same troubling analytics. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, thousands of emails from customers, employees, and shareholders demanding accountability. Melissa Grant stood outside Ethan Caldwell's office, holding a thick folder that seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. She knocked softly before entering. Ethan barely looked up from his desk. "Tell me this disappears by tomorrow," he said without greeting her. Melissa remained silent for a moment before placing the folder in front of him. "It is not disappearing," she answered carefully. "It is accelerating." Ethan opened the folder and frowned. Several longtime clients had requested emergency meetings. A national nonprofit had quietly removed his name from the list of keynote speakers at an upcoming leadership summit. Two board members wanted an explanation before the stock market opened the next morning. Human Resources had received messages from current and former employees describing workplace experiences that suddenly seemed important enough to share publicly. Ethan closed the folder with controlled frustration. "People are overreacting to one bad moment," he said. Melissa chose her next words with unusual caution. "Sir, they are not reacting to only one moment anymore. They are reacting to a pattern they believe they recognize." For the first time in years, Ethan found himself without an immediate response. Meanwhile, life continued much differently for Naomi. She finished another shift, changed into a simple sweater, and drove nearly 50 miles beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and purple. She stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to buy fresh fruit, soup, and her mother's favorite herbal tea before arriving at the small brick house that always felt warmer than its modest size suggested. Lorraine Brooks smiled the moment Naomi stepped through the front door. They shared dinner at the tiny kitchen table, talking about ordinary things like the blooming flowers outside, a neighbor's new puppy, and an old family recipe neither of them had perfected. Naomi never mentioned the headlines, the interviews, or the millions of strangers discussing her online. She believed peace was too precious to surrender to anger. As the evening settled into quiet stillness, her phone vibrated across the table. Daniel had sent only one short message. "Call me when you can. It is important." Naomi stepped onto the front porch and returned the call. Daniel's voice sounded both excited and nervous. "Reporters have been here all day," he said. "But that is not the biggest news. Someone from Caldwell Dynamics contacted the restaurant. They want to meet with you tomorrow morning." Naomi looked across the peaceful neighborhood where porch lights glowed beneath towering maple trees and children laughed somewhere in the distance. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a slow breath as a cool evening breeze brushed across her face. Deep inside, she sensed that tomorrow would change far more than either of them could possibly imagine. Morning sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Caldwell Dynamics headquarters, but inside the executive boardroom the atmosphere felt colder than the steel skyline outside. Ethan Caldwell stood near the panoramic windows with his hands folded behind his back, watching reporters gather on the sidewalk below. Satellite trucks lined the street. Camera crews adjusted their equipment. Every few minutes another notification appeared across his phone, each one carrying another headline questioning the gap between his carefully crafted public image and the man millions believed they had finally seen. Melissa Grant quietly entered the room carrying a fresh stack of reports. She did not speak immediately. The silence itself seemed heavy enough. Finally, she placed the documents on the conference table. "The latest survey is worse than yesterday," she said softly. "Public trust has dropped again overnight. Several charitable partners have suspended their campaigns until they receive an explanation. 3 major investors are requesting an emergency board meeting this afternoon." Ethan slowly exhaled, but said nothing. For years he had believed every problem could be solved with the right statement, the right interview, or the right negotiation. This time none of those solutions felt large enough. At nearly the same hour, Naomi Brooks parked outside Hawthorne and Glass and remained inside her aging sedan for a quiet moment before stepping out. She looked through the windshield as early sunlight reflected across the restaurant windows. The world outside seemed unchanged. Delivery trucks arrived. Bakers carried fresh bread through the rear entrance. Someone swept the front sidewalk with slow, familiar movements. Ordinary life continued despite everything happening beyond those walls. Naomi rested both hands on the steering wheel and closed her eyes for just a few seconds. She thought about her mother's gentle smile over breakfast, about the years spent working double shifts without complaint, and about the promise she had quietly made to herself long ago that no difficult person would ever decide the kind of heart she carried. She stepped out of the car, adjusted her apron, and walked inside with the same calm posture she had shown every day before the cameras ever found her. Daniel greeted her near the service station with an expression that mixed relief and concern. He explained that representatives from Caldwell Dynamics had already called twice that morning asking whether she would agree to a private meeting. Naomi listened without interruption. When he finished, she smiled politely. "People deserve the chance to speak honestly," she answered. "But honesty has to begin before forgiveness." Daniel nodded, understanding more from those few words than a longer conversation could have expressed. Outside, the city moved through another busy morning while millions of strangers continued discussing a woman they had never met. Many praised her patience. Others admired her quiet strength. Yet Naomi herself never opened the comments or searched for her own name. She preferred listening to the gentle clatter of coffee cups, the soft greeting of regular customers, and the familiar sound of the kitchen beginning another day. Those ordinary noises reminded her that real life happened far away from trending headlines. Several miles away, Ethan remained standing beside the window when his phone vibrated once more. This time the message came directly from the chairman of the board. Only one sentence appeared across the screen. "We need to talk before the market opens." Ethan stared at the words as his own reflection looked back from the glass, no longer appearing as confident as the executive who had entered the room an hour earlier. For the first time in many years, success, influence, and wealth could not quiet the growing weight of a single undeniable truth. Respect could never be demanded after. It had been refused. The emergency board meeting lasted less than 40 minutes, but every minute stripped away another layer of certainty Ethan Caldwell had spent decades building. Around the long walnut table sat directors who had defended him through economic downturns, difficult acquisitions, and public criticism. Today, none of them interrupted as the general counsel outlined the growing consequences. Several institutional investors had paused negotiations. A national leadership conference had withdrawn its invitation. Employees from regional offices had begun submitting internal letters describing a workplace culture built on fear rather than respect. Every new headline led reporters back to the same video, replaying the moment that millions now recognized by heart. When the presentation ended, the chairman folded his reading glasses and looked directly at Ethan. "Nobody forced that decision," he said quietly. The camera only recorded it. The room fell silent. No one argued. No one searched for another explanation. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes to the polished table where his own reflection appeared distorted beneath the bright ceiling lights. For the first time, he realized the greatest damage had not come from a teenager holding a phone. It had come from seeing himself exactly as everyone else had. Across town, Naomi Brooks had just finished serving lunch when Daniel approached with a visitor waiting near the entrance. Melissa Grant stood alone, dressed in a simple navy suit without the usual corporate entourage. Her expression carried none of the polished confidence she displayed during television interviews. She introduced herself politely and thanked Naomi for agreeing to speak with her for a few minutes. They sat near an empty corner table where afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Melissa did not begin with legal language or carefully prepared statements. Instead, she took a slow breath before speaking honestly. "I came because I needed to see the person everyone has been talking about," she admitted. Naomi smiled gently. "Most people online only know a few minutes of my life." Melissa nodded. "Maybe, but those few minutes have caused thousands of people inside our company to start telling the truth about years they never felt safe discussing." Naomi listened quietly without interrupting. Melissa explained that several employees had described a culture where kindness was often mistaken for weakness and silence had become the safest choice. The viral video had not created those stories. It had simply given people the courage to share them. Naomi rested her hands around a warm cup of tea and looked through the restaurant window toward families walking peacefully along the sidewalk. "Sometimes people stay quiet because they believe nobody will believe them," she said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is one person choosing not to look away." Melissa remained silent for several seconds before asking the question she had rehearsed all morning. "Mr. Caldwell wants to apologize to you personally. Not through reporters. Not through attorneys. Face to face." Naomi did not answer immediately. She watched sunlight shimmer across the glass, remembering her mother's words from years earlier. Forgiveness should never erase accountability, but accountability should never erase the possibility of change. Finally, she looked back at Melissa with the same calm expression that had remained unchanged through every difficult moment of the past few days. "I will meet him," she said quietly. "Not because he lost something important. Because I hope he finds something even more valuable." Melissa lowered her head, unexpectedly moved by the answer. As she walked back toward the waiting car, her phone vibrated with another news alert. Caldwell Dynamics shares had fallen again that afternoon. Yet for the first time since the crisis began, she believed the company's future would not be determined by another press release or another interview. It would depend entirely on what happened when two people from completely different worlds finally sat across from each other with nothing left to hide. The meeting took place 2 days later in a quiet community center overlooking Baltimore Harbor rather than inside a corporate office surrounded by cameras and security. Large windows welcomed the gentle afternoon light, and the steady sound of water moving against the docks filled the long pauses between words. There were no reporters waiting outside, no microphones resting on polished tables, and no photographers hoping to capture another headline. Only Ethan Caldwell, Naomi Brooks, Melissa Grant, and a single legal observer sat together in a simple room where expensive titles carried no more weight than honest conversation. Ethan entered first, wearing a plain charcoal jacket instead of the tailored suits that had become part of his public identity. The confidence that once accompanied every step had been replaced by something quieter. He waited until Naomi took her seat before speaking. For several seconds he searched for carefully prepared sentences, but every polished phrase suddenly sounded empty. Finally, he looked directly at her and spoke without notes. "I have replayed that evening more times than I can count," he said softly. "At first I blamed the camera. Then I blamed the internet. Then I blamed everyone who shared the video. Eventually, I ran out of people to blame except myself." Naomi remained silent, allowing him to continue. "The person people saw in that restaurant was not someone pretending to be me," Ethan admitted. "It was me. I cannot change what I did. I cannot erase what millions watched. I can only acknowledge that I treated you without the respect every human being deserves." The room became still enough that the ticking wall clock sounded unusually loud. Melissa lowered her eyes while the legal observer quietly closed his notebook, sensing that the most important part of the meeting no longer belonged in official records. Naomi folded her hands together and studied Ethan for a long moment. She noticed the exhaustion beneath his eyes, the hesitation in his voice, and the absence of excuses that had once defined every public statement released by the company. An apology matters, she said gently. But what matters even more is what happens after the apology. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. Naomi continued speaking with the same calm sincerity that had guided every difficult moment since this story began. You embarrassed one person in public. But if this experience helps thousands of people inside your company feel respected tomorrow, then something good can still grow from something painful. Ethan listened without interrupting. Those words settled more deeply than any criticism he had read online because they carried no anger, only hope. He reached into a leather folder and carefully slid a document across the table. It outlined a new company initiative that would create independent workplace respect training, confidential employee reporting systems, and scholarships for hospitality workers pursuing higher education. This is only a beginning, he said quietly. I do not expect forgiveness to be earned in one afternoon. Naomi looked through the proposal before gently pushing it back toward him. Keep building it, she replied. Not because people are watching now. Build it because one day they will not be watching anymore. Ethan lowered his head, understanding the difference. As the meeting ended, they stood and shook hands without applause, without celebration, and without anyone announcing that everything had been fixed. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the calm harbor, casting long ribbons of golden light over the water. For the first time in many years, Ethan walked away carrying something far heavier than success, yet far more valuable than reputation. He carried the responsibility to become the man he had always claimed to be. 1 year later, the memory of that evening inside Hawthorne and Glass no longer belonged only to a viral video. It had become part of countless conversations in classrooms, boardrooms, restaurants, and family dinner tables where people spoke about dignity, leadership, and the quiet courage of choosing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. The headlines had long since disappeared beneath newer stories, but the lives shaped by those few unforgettable minutes continued moving forward in ways no one could have predicted. Hawthorne and Glass still welcomed guests every evening beneath the same warm chandeliers, yet something subtle had changed. New employees completed a hospitality program centered not only on service, but also on mutual respect. Managers often reminded their teams that every person who walked through the front door, whether wearing an expensive business suit or a simple work uniform, deserved to be treated with equal humanity. Those lessons had become part of the restaurant's identity, inspired by someone who had never asked to become an example. Naomi Brooks no longer worked double shifts carrying heavy trays across crowded dining rooms. Instead, she directed a nonprofit training initiative that partnered with restaurants, hotels, and small businesses across Maryland, helping employers build healthier workplaces where compassion was considered a strength rather than a weakness. Her office was modest, filled with books, handwritten thank you notes, and framed photographs from graduation ceremonies attended by young hospitality workers whose scholarships had opened doors they once believed were permanently closed. On one wall hung a small photograph of her mother, Lorraine Brooks, smiling beneath bright spring sunshine. Every morning before beginning work, Naomi paused in front of that picture for a quiet moment of gratitude. She never forgot where the journey had begun. Across the city, Caldwell dynamics looked different as well. Independent employee surveys showed growing trust. Staff turnover steadily declined. Leadership training now emphasized listening before speaking and accountability before authority. Ethan Caldwell rarely appeared on magazine covers anymore, and he no longer sought the spotlight that had once defined his career. Instead, he spent much of his time visiting regional offices, sitting quietly with employees whose names he had never taken the time to learn before. Those conversations rarely made the news, but they slowly transformed the culture inside the company far more effectively than any carefully scripted speech ever had. On a clear autumn afternoon, Naomi attended the opening ceremony for a new hospitality education center funded jointly by community organizations and private donors. Families gathered beneath colorful banners while young students laughed together outside the entrance. As Naomi finished welcoming the first class, she noticed a familiar figure, standing quietly near the back of the audience. Ethan had arrived alone, without reporters, security cameras, or corporate branding. He remained among the crowd, applauding alongside everyone else as the ribbon was gently lowered and the doors opened for the students waiting outside. Their eyes met only briefly across the courtyard. No words were necessary. Naomi smiled with quiet warmth before turning to greet another family entering the building. Ethan returned the smile with a small respectful nod before walking away into the afternoon light. A cool breeze carried golden leaves across the sidewalk as children's laughter echoed through the open doors behind them. The sun settled lower above the city skyline, painting long shadows across the pavement where strangers continued crossing paths, each carrying stories no one else could fully see. Somewhere beyond the fading light, another camera was almost certainly recording another ordinary moment that might one day change someone's life forever. But this time, the lasting memory would not be a moment of humiliation. It would be the quiet reminder that real strength is never measured by the power to shame another person. It is measured by the courage to choose respect when no one believes it matters. Because in the end, kindness leaves an echo that lasts far longer than pride.